Welcome to Worldview Matters, discussing controversial issues, discerning current events, defending biblical Christianity. No topic off limits. And now, here's your host, David Fiorazzo.
Hey friends, welcome to another Worldview Matters show. You are in for a treat today. I've got a friend, a powerful and just a bold pro-life speaker and advocate, Seth Gruber. I want to bring him in right away because we just have a short amount of time. SethGruber.com, White Rose Resistance. Good to see you, brother. How you doing?
Doing well, David. Congrats on your success and continue to speak unapologetically, bro.
Well, yours too. I've been looking at your website, where you're heading: Kansas, Florida, Missouri, Michigan, of course, California. So tell us a little bit about what you've been doing lately. And I don't know, how long have you been out there speaking and trying to raise awareness about life in the womb?
Well, I just turned 32, and I gave my first speech on abortion at 18. And then 19, 20, 21, 22, my 4 years in college, I started speaking in local youth groups, churches, seminars, training things, stuff like that. And then went full time in pro-life ministry when I graduated college in 2014. So that was about 9 years ago. But yeah, we launched the White Rose Resistance right after the overturning of Roe versus Wade, sort of providentially. And we exist to educate the public, discredit the opposition, sometimes maybe mock the opposition, and inspire a movement within the church, which was always supposed to be the bulwark to life and liberty, right? And we have forgotten, David, how to be salty. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. We have forgotten how to be salty in the American church. And the scriptures say that such useless salt will be actually thrown underfoot and trampled. We have been fulfilling my pastor Rob McCoy's prophetic warning that the church in America seems to wait downstream to pick up human heartache that we helped create through our political apathy upstream. Right, because we've been living under the spell of the Johnson Amendment, David,
yes.
Right? We don't want to be seen as associated with politics, right? There's a separation of church and state, whatever the hell that means. And which I always say, well, then shouldn't we keep the state out of the church? Right? It's just a one-way street. The state has no intention of keeping its hands out of the church. But for some reason, what the church should be prevented from seeking to influence secular governments for God's purposes. Like, do we as Christians actually believe that the Bible and our Lord has good ideas on how to govern societies? Or do we think that it's just full of a bunch of wise statements on how to live? Do we think it's merely the salvation of souls, and then that's all the Lord has to say about our lives? Yes, let's keep the gospel centered. But what is the gospel? Is it simply repent and believe? I recall the first words of Jesus's ministry being, repent and believe, for the kingdom of God is at hand. And the word kingdom outperforms the word love in the New Testament nearly 3-1. So Jesus talked about his kingdom far more than like love and repenting. There's actually a kingdom mindset you're supposed to have as a believer. So what is that kingdom mindset? I mean, it's to occupy until he comes. It's to defend the cause of the orphan and the widow. Right? Pure and undefiled religion is this: care for orphans and widows in their distress. God always is, Jesus, God, Old Testament, New Testament, always talking about justice, right? The cause of the orphan, those who can't defend themselves. This is why in Isaiah 1, David, when it says that the people were walking down a half mile from Jerusalem down to the valley of Hinnom, and they were having great worship services on the hill in Jerusalem. David, one tiny little problem. They were in the evening. They were cooking their children in the valley of Hinnom. And at the end of Isaiah 1, God says, He says, I'm sick. I'm tired of your worship, your songs. He says, I'm sick of them. He says, I'm not listening to you anymore, David. Wow. He says, I'm not listening to you anymore. Your festivals and your songs, they make me sick. And so he says, I give you over, right, to be ruled by those who hate you. And he says, but then he gives a solution. He says, so stop doing evil and start doing good, right? Correct oppression seek justice, defend the cause of the orphan and the widow. Why does the orphan come up so much in the scriptures, David? Jesus loves the orphan because the orphan's life is endangered because their parents are dead, right? So who's their protector? Who's their defender? Well, how much more should we care about and protect the orphan in the womb whose life is endangered, not because their parents are dead, David, but because their parents want them dead? We cannot bring the orphan's parents back, okay? But we can save the orphan in the womb from the wrath of their parents. And for people who don't like, that's not very winsome, Russell Moore wouldn't approve of that. Yeah, I don't care. You want to find some of God's most colorful language in scripture, it's when he's addressing child sacrifice in the Old Testament. Okay, yes, I understand women may obtain an abortion because they were pressured or their degenerate father and she's a teenager and he pressured. I understand there's difficult circumstances, but the vast majority of abortions are chosen by the woman. She chose to get the abortion. You may not say, I hate my child, but what is more hateful than murdering a little baby simply for the crime of being unwanted? I mean, the Bible gives us everything we need to understand this. So what are we doing at the White Rose Resistance, David? We're trying to awaken the blood-bought bride of Christ to be salty again, to be like Gideon in Judges 6, and walk out of the little caves that we've been hiding in and start actively tearing down the high places of child sacrifice in America. I'm convinced that much of the cultural rot that we're living through politically as well, David, over the last few decades, and certainly the last 3 or 4 years, can actually be traced back to our tolerance of child sacrifice in America. We no longer have the Father's heart. We are no longer, David, angered or saddened by what inflames our Father to anger and drives him to tears. We do not have a kingdom mindset, by and large, in the American church, right? That because we have been preaching orthodoxy with no orthopraxy. We condemn the culture of death to a certain extent in our churches and our small groups and with our Christian communities, right, David? We say, oh, well, I don't really like chopping the genitals off of a 14-year-old because they say, they're the other gender. I don't really agree with gay porn being taught through cartoons and sex ed in the public school. I'm not really for that, David. But we never do anything largely as Christians to stand against the culture of death that we say we don't like, that we say we're opposed to. Yep. Where's our saltiness? We're like Lot in Genesis, who's the Christian influencer of his day, David, right? He was at the city gates when the angels came to San Francisco. Sodom. Dang it. Sodom and Gomorrah. And he takes the angels to his house, remember? And then it says, men from all parts of the city came to Lot's house. That's what it says, David. Men from all parts of the city came to Lot's house. So every part of culture descending down, coming towards that one man who's described as a righteous man, right? And then it says, they say, hey, Lot, bring those men out that we might have sex with them. Okay, well, they weren't men, they were angels, David. So do you understand why God wanted to turn Sodom now? These people want angel sex. My goodness, right? And Lot walks out onto his front porch. Now, Lot's a righteous man, the Bible tells us, right? Apparently, he's in the kingdom. Apparently, like he was a righteous man, and he walks out and he says, brothers and sisters. Go read it, guys, if you're listening to this. He calls them brothers or sisters. The first thing I want to say is, Lot, stop trying to get crumbs from the table of secular progressivism so you can keep your 501c3 status. They're not your brothers and sisters. They want to sleep with angels. They want angel sex. Lot, stop calling them your brothers and sisters. Stop trying to make Christianity culturally respectable so you can be invited to write articles in the New York Times. Tim Keller, Ed Stetzer. Yes, I just said that. Yes. So, he says brothers and sisters, and then he says, do not do this wicked or abominable thing. So, David, he calls their actions wicked and abominable. So Lot was willing to speak just as much truth as the spirit of the age allowed him to. He was willing to condemn the evil of the culture in which he found himself. Lot faced his own culture war, just like we have our own culture war today, David. And Lot would only speak as much truth as he could get away with lest he lose his idol of cultural respectability, lest the let's have sex with angels sexual revolutionaries would cast him out into utter darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. He had made an idol, not out of being political, which is what the left-wing evangelicals critique conservatives of doing. He had made an idol out of being apolitical, out of being perceived as neutral, so that he could get the attaboys and claps and fundings of the George Soroses and the high priests of humanism with whom he had to live in community and in the city. And so what happens to Lot? Okay, let's see, David. His wife becomes in death what he should have been in life, a pillar of salt. Lot was saved, but he wasn't salty. He wasn't preserving anything that mattered to his king. I mean, you talk about gauging the masculinity and strength of a man, David. It starts with, can you protect, provide, and love for your own, right? Like, there are actually qualifications in the scriptures, aren't there, David, about like, you can't be a pastor or an elder if like you're not managing your household and your family first. Like, talk about the first line of defense that we would judge any man by. And what does Lot do then? After he critiques the culture of death to a certain extent, he says, here are my daughters. Have sex with them instead.
Jeez.
Brothers and sisters, if you're listening to this, you can be saved but not salty. You can make it into the kingdom by the hair on your bum. In fact, the scriptures say that, David. It says some will be saved as if by fire. Meaning like some of us, David, are getting singed on the way in. You know, like, whoa! Like, all right, Lord, thank you, I guess by grace and grace alone. But brother and sister, what's going to be your story at the marriage supper of the Lamb? Yeah, let me tell you what Lot's story is at the marriage supper of the Lamb. I gave my daughters to be raped by a mob, and God forgave me. By grace and grace alone. But what's going to be your story at the marriage supper of the Lamb? And so, we in America are making the Sodomites and Gomorrahs blush with what we're doing. I think that most members of the Democrat Party today would turn most of the Sodom and Gomorrahites into conservatives. Like, we are so far gone past the evil activities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And yet that was how Lot chose to deal with his culture war, was to offer up the posterity to the sexualized mob in order to remain relevant, so that you can not create a roadblock to people hearing the gospel from your church. And it's the idol of cultural respectability is what it is. Much of the pastors in America and our Christian institutions and colleges are not Christian leaders. They're institutional managers. And they will only speak as much truth as the spirit of the age allows them, like Lot. So we're trying to create the next generation of Gideons, David, at the White Rose Resistance, and not Lots. Because Gideon dealt with his culture war very differently than Lot did. And we can talk about that if you'd like. But you and I believe that unless the church wakes up in America in the next month or year or two, we win in the end. We've read the end of the book. But like, that's not the point. The point is, how are we going to steward what we've been given in a constitutional republic where we, the people, are the sovereign, to give God a reason to show America mercy?
Yes, brother, thank you. I mean, you said so much, and I could come up with a half a dozen follow-up questions, but we've got to take a very quick break. First of all, I thought of Isaiah saying, you people honor me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. And just so many other things. I wrote a chapter in my previous book called the second biggest lie in America, the separation of church and state. And I'm glad you brought that up. I'm also frustrated, as you have been, about the political ping pong when it comes to pro-life legislation. Give a little, take a little, give a little. And this has been going on since 1973. Well, we've got to start setting incrementalism aside and saying we need to abolish the murder of the unborn. We've got to take a break. We'll be right back with Seth Gruber on Worldview Matters.
Today's show is brought to you by Harbinger's Daily, world news biblically understood. Stay informed at harbingersdaily.com.
WhiteRoseResistance.com, SethGruber.com. I want to read a quick quote from Pastor Jack Hibbs, who who said God is using Seth to literally shake the demonic strongholds and the worldview mindset of people who have a complete opposite view from what God has regarding life. And Seth, he calls you a warrior brother. And I agree with him, and I really appreciate your voice. To some who are viewing this program, you might think, boy, he comes on strong. I think we need to drop all the, let's just kind of be nice and be courteous and be kind. We need to just be straight shooters today. We're running out of time, friends. We need to redeem the time, and we are getting so close to the end, and we've lost a lot of ground culturally in America. Seth, tell me, I read something about Hans and Sophie Scholl, or is it Hans? White Rose Resistance. Tell us a little bit more about them.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you shared that, Pastor Jack. Pastor Jack's my earthly hero, and has had a greater impact and fuel on my ministry and calling than probably any other human being in America. And he's a dear brother and mentor. And if I could bottle the spiritual, moral, intellectual, and political clarity of Jack Hibbs and inject it like a booster shot into the arms of American pastors, I could end abortion in this country in 1 year. If it's a booster shot, it probably wouldn't work. But that's a conversation for another time. So the White Rose Resistance, David, which I am the CEO and founder of, which we launched publicly right after the overturning of Roe, is actually based on the original White Rose Resistance in Nazi Germany in 1942, 1943 timeframe. And the parallels between the evils, right, in the Third Reich, David, and the evils today are so stark, they're so heartbreaking. And of course, it's like every time you bring up the Nazis, people say like, you can't bring that up. It's like the only historical analogy that liberals know. Like any leftist, it's like the only historical analogy they know. It's like, were you aware of any other tyrannical regimes or like evil societies or cultures like over the last 300 years? It's like, no, it's like Hitler, right? It's like what they say about like any conservative that poses any political threat to their entrenched regime. Anyways, I'm getting on a tangent, but the parallels are necessary because they're real, right? And here we are, 80 years later, and we're facing the same struggle. We're facing the same threats. We're actually facing the same worldview, David, actually. Speaking of the name of your program, Worldview Matters. We're facing the same spirit of eugenics. Yes. Eugenics, properly defined, by the way, means the root word means good in birth, which means what, guys? That some people are not good in birth, right? So eugenics is concerned with certain genes or qualities or generational characteristics, right? So if you're Margaret Sanger, the founder of Planned Parenthood, right, the little piece of human excrement she was, you're not necessarily out for Black people in general. Like Sanger was fine with Black people who were not alcoholics, didn't have epilepsy, didn't have any intellectual or physical disabilities. And Planned Parenthood has deflected criticism from their eugenics history and present by saying, well, look at all the Black people we have on our board of directors. You have to understand, like Sanger, Planned Parenthood, abortion, it's not racism in the way that we think of racism today. It's not like melanin. No, eugenics is actually more sinister and evil than racism, because racism will just be concerned with an ethnicity or a skin color, right? Eugenics is actually far larger than that. For example, there were plenty of white people Sanger hated, and the eugenicists in America in the early 19th century hated, because they had a history of alcoholism in their family, right? Or a history of crime, right? Like family members in and out of jail. So not well-performing, productive citizens, right? It could be physical or mental disabilities, right? Down syndrome, or maybe you had a physical disability. Maybe you were missing a limb. These were like anyone could be opened up to have the target of the eugenicist placed on them, not merely Black people alone, if I'm speaking clearly, if that makes sense. And so Chesterton said that if Darwinism was the doctrine of the survival of the fittest, then eugenics was the doctrine of the survival of the nastiest. Can you think of a nastier human being than someone who looks at our brother Nick Vujicic and goes, ew, oh gosh, he shouldn't be allowed to reproduce, right?
Jeez.
Who looks at a baby diagnosed with Down syndrome in the womb and says, kill him all, kill him. And so that's what we're dealing with. Eugenics was in the Third Reich. We have eugenics here today. I mean,
Yep.
eugenics labels people as unfit. If you want to know the most used phrase that the eugenicists in between like the early 1900s and like 1930 in America used, it was the term unfit and fit and unfit. In fact, Sanger once said that birth control is not contraception thoughtlessly and indiscriminately practiced. It means the cultivation and release of the better racial elements in our society and a gradual suppression and elimination of defective stocks, those human weeds which threaten the blossoming of the finest flowers of American civilization. Right? So there are certain genes and qualities that make you a fine blossoming flower, but if you're a defective stock or human weed, then you need to be weeded out and you shouldn't be allowed to have kids and we should forcibly sterilize you. I mean, this is a history of eugenics. So when they call an unborn baby like unwanted, like the Nazis had a term for that. It was undesirables, right? Or Lebensunwertensleben, which means life unworthy of life. So every baby killed through abortion is actually a eugenics injustice because the human being is described as unfit to live, as unwanted, because society has deemed them as such. Obviously, Down syndrome, you got all this killing of people that don't meet the intellectual capacity that the liberal establishment establishes. Like all of this is eugenics, okay? Like here's another example. The abortion pill, RU486, it's called, okay, David? It stands for Roussel-Ucloff, Roussel-Ucloff 486. Roussel-Ucloff is the manufacturer who invented the abortion pill. It's a French manufacturer, okay? And Bill Clinton brought the abortion pill to America in the year 2000. Shocker. Well, Roussel-Ucloff has a majority shareholder named Hoechst AG. Hoechst AG. Now, Hoechst AG emerged from the breakup of a German chemical company known as IG Farben. IG Farben, David, was infamous for creating a cyanide gas known as Zyklon B. Zyklon B was the gas used in Nazi death camps to murder Jews. So Hoechst AG simply shifted from creating poison to murder Jews to creating poison to murder babies. It's the same company, David. So when I say that we're facing the same battle, like I'm actually giving you like a literal example of how it's like some of the same companies and individuals behind both of these various eugenics revolutions. Okay, so who were Hans and Sophie Scholl as we wind down here? They were 20-somethings standing up against the eugenics and Holocaust in Germany. And a young woman named Sophie Scholl, and the namesake of my third child and my newest daughter, was walking the sidewalks of Munich, Germany in 1942, David. And she found a paper on the ground, just a little leaflet on the ground. And she opened it up, and it was explicitly condemning the crimes of the Nazis and asking the good people to wake up, asking Christians to wake up. Sophie's reading this leaflet, David, and you know what she's thinking? Because I've studied this a lot, okay? She's thinking, this sounds like a lot like my brother Hans. He talks like this at dinner all the time. This sounds like something that could have been written by him. Well, come to find out, David, the White Rose Resistance had not only been co-founded, it was being run by none other than her older brother Hans.
Wow.
Who at 24 years old was just trying to protect his little sister, David. He knew how dangerous political resistance was to the Third Reich in 1942. He didn't want his sister involved. But Sophie at 21 years old, had loved the Lord. She had a deep and abiding faith. Her father had spent some time in prison for publicly criticizing Hitler. So she came from good stock. And she becomes the youngest member and the only female of the White Rose Resistance in Munich, Germany. And they would stay up late writing and printing and distributing anti-Nazi leaflets all around Germany. And they take trains in the middle of the night and drop off these leaflets, David. And so in 1943, they took things to the next level. And on February 18th, 1943, 80 years ago and some change, Hans and Sophie, brother and sister, walked onto the campus at the University of Munich. Now, you have to remember, your listeners have to remember that the academies, like the clergy, had largely been co-opted into silence and obedience by the Nazi state, right? This was very dangerous, is my point. During class time, when the halls were quiet, Hans and Sophie walked the University of Munich, dropping off piles of their leaflets all around the university, David. And then in this iconic scene, Sophie walked to the third floor balcony of the University of Munich, and she threw hundreds of leaflets down to the atrium below. And what happens when you throw paper? It goes everywhere. That was the point. The janitor, a committed Nazi, caught Hans and Sophie in the act, called the Gestapo on the spot. and Hans and Sophie were arrested that afternoon on February 18th, 1943. They spent the next 4 days in prison, being brutally interrogated and physically abused, and they refused to implicate or rat out any of their other friends or members of the White Rose Resistance. To make a long story short, they had their heads chopped off on February 22nd, 1943, 4 days later. And Sophie spoke with some of the most prophetic language in spiritual and moral clarity that seemed to transcend most of the pulpits in Germany at the time. And I think, David, she was asking the same question we're asking today, which is, what is going on and how did we get here? And you guys can check out my sermon from Pastor Jack Hibbs' church on his YouTube channel or my YouTube channel, but we tell that whole story. But the point is this. After they had their heads chopped off, they missed a meeting they had that next week, a meeting that they never made because they were killed. And that meeting was with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the founder of the Confessing Church in Germany and one of the most prophetic voices of that century, who was hung naked at Flossenburg prison on April 15, 1945, whose final words were, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." So we're rebuilding the White Rose Resistance for this
Praise
generation against our silent but far more deadly Holocaust of abortion before it's too late.
Brother, that story needs to be told. I'm glad you're out there telling it. I'm thankful that you started the White Rose Resistance, and I love silence in the face of evil is itself evil. God will not hold us guiltless. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. We have been duped, deceived in the church to be silent, to keep our faith behind church walls. And that's what you were talking about as we come full circle of this program when you talked about what happened to the...
Nailed it.
I mean, what happened to the salt and light? I mean, we know what's going on with this world. I mean, John R.W. Stott said, we should not ask what's wrong with this world. That diagnosis has already been given. We should be asking what has happened to the salt and light, meaning the Christians, the influence in our culture, in the church. And it starts with giving these young babies human beings. Well, they're not potential human beings. They're human beings with potential, right? Giving them the right to be born. Seth, we have to do this again. Do you promise? Can I put you on the spot here?
Of course, for you, David. Yeah.
He will be back. SethGruber.com. God bless you, brother, and I thank you for the work that you do. Thanks for coming on Worldview Matters.
Thank you.
All right, take it easy. Man, I could listen to that guy all day, and I will look up that sermon. He was out at Jack Hibbs' church, Southern California, out there in Calvary Chapel, Chino Valley. And Rob McCoy, too, his pastor, man, another troublemaker who I think he had the audacity to keep his church open during COVID and got sued by the tyrannical government there. But anyway, we've got to move on. Tomorrow, Jay Siegert of the StartingPointProject.com. Guys, thank you so much for supporting the show. Your donations are tax deductible. Please share on social media. And we appreciate every person that says, let me just get this out there because it is a new show. God bless you. And as always, keep speaking the truth about things that matter.